Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you today. My name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. It's exciting to be with you all on this fine Wednesday. We're going to be talking in a little bit about Surgeon Charles S. Tripler, the very first medical director of the Army of the Potomac. Promises to be an exciting program. We'll get to that in just a little bit. I want to give everyone time to hop on the stream and join me today. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to watch this from the beginning. If for whatever reason you maybe missed a little bit of the beginning of the presentation or you have to leave early, never fear. These videos continue to exist on our Facebook page and eventually on our YouTube channel. So these, if you missed some of this, you can still go back and rewatch it, rewatch whatever you didn't catch, or I'm going to have some PowerPoint slides here. If there was a quote you wanted to write down, you can always go back and pause it. So that'll all be there for you if you need it. If you've been enjoying these videos, we hope that while we're waiting for us to get started here, I would love it if you would become a member of the museum and support our efforts. If you've been watching these videos and enjoying them, becoming a member is one of the best ways to help us support these efforts, these videos that we do. And I know there's a handful of our members in the comments, Eddie and Robert, already tuning in. Appreciate it. Oh my, so we have Mariette from South Africa. That's very exciting. Thank you so much for tuning in today. And Eddie says in the comments, looking forward to hearing about Tripler since I thought it was bad that the Army demolished Letterman Hospital. Letterman Hospital is massive and beloved. Yeah, so the story of Tripler, I know I have found to be pretty interesting because I just assumed that whoever Letterman took over must have not had any idea what he was doing. So we'll get to whether or not Tripler did in fact know what he was doing in just a little bit. Rosemary tuning in from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Carrie from Arnoldsville, Georgia. Richard from Concord, North Carolina. Robert's saying he needs to renew his membership. Yes, better get on that. Like I was saying, one of the best ways to support us and these videos, the museum, is to become a member of the institution, and you can find a link in the comments to do that. If you're not at a point where you can do that right now, one of the other ways you can help us is very simple. Everyone can do it right now. You can like this video. The more likes we have, the more widely it shares around. And you can also share the video. Send it to your friends that you think might be interested in this topic. And you can do that during the stream or after or wherever. Things like that really help us out quite a bit. I see Ryan tuning in from Colorado, always looks forward to our program, so we appreciate it, Ryan. We always look forward to seeing you in the comments. So well, this is wonderful. Glad that we have folks tuning in here already. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into what we're going to talk about today. I have a little PowerPoint. It's not as full of images as maybe I would like it to be. But it's got some juicy quotes in there, and I think you'll enjoy it. So, whoops, hold on here. There we are. So I'm not going to be able to see your comments while I'm in this PowerPoint presentation here. If you have any questions at all throughout, please drop them in the comments, and I'll get to them when I finish this up. So we're going to be talking about the very first medical director of the Army of the Potomac, Surgeon Charles S. Tripler. And eventually, the second medical director of the Army of the Potomac is someone by the name of Jonathan Letterman. I'm sure you've heard quite a bit about Letterman from us on the various videos that we've done over our Facebook page. He's the father of modern battlefield medicine. He's revolutionary in all sorts of ways. So there's all kinds of good reasons why you should know Letterman. He totally remakes the Union Medical Department, systematizes it, does all kinds of great things. And I'd heard of Charles Tripler before, but I never really knew too much about him. I just assumed he wasn't very good at his job because Letterman was so good at what he did that, again, I kind of projected that, he probably wasn't that great. But I was reading through the medical and surgical history, and I came across a massive report that Tripler wrote basically about his entire time as medical director. So the Army of the Potomac is formed in the aftermath of the First Battle of Bull Run. So it technically doesn't exist at Bull Run, although many of the units that will make up the Army of the Potomac fought at Bull Run. So there's some crossover, but it's technically not in existence. So his report covers from shortly after Bull Run all the way through the end of the 7 days battles. So it covers basically about a year, not quite, but basically from August of 1861 all the way through early July of 1862. And so this presentation, it's certainly not going to be an exhaustive treatment of what Tripler does during that time. I'm drawing heavily just from this one source, from this one report, and there's even more that I could have taken out of it. I'm not bringing in too many other sources here, and so this isn't exactly a finished product in terms of, the be-all, end-all of everything Tripler does during this time. But this is more so meant to kind of give you a thumbnail sketch, just kind of what it was like, a proverbial day in the life of a medical director of a brand new army and the sorts of troubles that they encountered. We'll see if we get through the whole thing. We got about an hour, and we'll see where we end up here. So again, if you have any questions, drop them in the comments. I'll get to them at the end. Can't see the comments right now. So let's have a good time. So it all starts with, our story starts with the First Battle of Bull Run. Just to pull one quote from a New York newspaper in the aftermath of the battle, wrote, "We are all inexpressibly pained to learn that very inadequate provisions have been made by the regular authorities for the proper care of the wounded in that late battle. It seems incredible that some of our gallant soldiers, for sheer want of hospital garments, are even yet sweltering in their bloody uniforms, festering with fever and maddened with thirst." So long story short, it's a disaster from a medical perspective. And it's clear that things need to be changed dramatically in the aftermath of First Bull Run. It's like, okay, this didn't work. Now we need to find something that will work. And it's such a disaster that basically, the entire Northern public, via this and many other newspaper reports, the entire Northern public is very aware of some very specific details of how the medical department just did not come through when it came to caring for the wounded soldiers, getting them into hospitals, getting them adequate medicine in a timely manner, providing hospital accommodations at all. It's a long list of ways that the medical department initially failed in a very dramatic way. And so who is brought to bring order out of the chaos? But this, I was going to say good looking man. It's a little rough, his appearance, but hey, he makes a good effort of it. Charles Stewart Tripler, age 55 in 1861. He was a career military surgeon, and he's appointed the first medical director. And he reports for duty in Washington, D.C. on August 12th, 1861, when he's tasked with bringing order out of chaos. There's a total lack of organization. So this just paints a picture of what you're coming into. Sometimes when you start a new job, sometimes your coworkers help you get up to speed really quickly and you're very comfortable. Other times you're brought in to basically do damage control. And that's kind of where Charles Tripler finds himself. So he writes that, quote, no system in reference to the admission or discharge of patients. Every regimental surgeon sent what men he pleased to the general hospital without knowing whether there was room for them or not, and men were discharged from the hospitals with no means provided to ensure their return to their regiments. It was not an unusual circumstance for sick men to pass the night in ambulances, wandering the streets from hospital to hospital, seeking admission. I could find no information anywhere as to what regiments were present or whether they had medical officers or not. My first endeavor was to find out who were the medical officers of the several regiments, how the hospital departments were supplied, and what was the strength of the regiments, how many of the men were sick, and what were the prevailing diseases. So he's coming into this situation. He knows nothing. He doesn't know who's under his command. He doesn't know how many prospective patients, how many soldiers are under his command. He doesn't know how many medical officers are under his command. He doesn't know who's in the hospital. He doesn't know who's not. He doesn't know who's sick. He doesn't know who's healthy. It's a complete and utter disaster in terms of organization. So he needs to bring order out of this chaos. And so, like I mentioned, one of the first tasks that he needs to figure out is, who exactly am I in charge of? As things stood initially, a surgeon and an assistant surgeon were appointed for each volunteer regiment by the governor of that state. And the appointees would be examined by an examining board to kind of determine their qualifications, which was also appointed by the governor, and then ultimately approved by the Secretary of War. So as it stands initially, Tripler, as the medical director, has no say at all over where these medical officers are coming from. And that becomes a problem because in some instances, colonels of regiments would outright refuse the appointed surgeons. And others, colonel would say that they could choose their own surgeon. And this made things, of course, very confusing about who exactly, does the colonel recognize this appointed surgeon or not? Is there someone else acting in the capacity of a surgeon? And where they fall under this kind of medical department that Tripler is trying to organize. And that also leaves a number of regiments with either no medical officer or medical officers of dubious skill. And then, of course, just the cherry on top, no one had thought to attach surgeons at all to cavalry units or artillery batteries, as sort of different categories of troops. Just in terms of people's calculations for how this was to be done, it didn't even enter into them. So Tripler sets about throughout the days of August to try and figure out who his people are. And then once he figures out who they are, it quickly becomes apparent that some of them are not very skilled, and they're outright, not really medical professionals or not competent at their jobs. And so in September, less than a month after taking command, Tripler, September 7th to be precise, Tripler organizes an examining board located, within the Army of the Potomac. So basically as a kind of second line of trying to professionalize after this kind of board that the state governors appoint. And the purpose is basically if a doctor is serving in the Army and they're not good at what they do, maybe they shouldn't be doing what they do if they're incompetent or unqualified for whatever reason. And so the very first session, they removed 12 surgeons, and they would periodically reconvene every time there was a complaint or a case that needed to be seen. So he's already putting into place systems that are designed to ensure that the soldiers get the best medical care that they possibly can. His next task is to delegate. Tripler is just one man, and he cannot personally oversee the health of the approximately 200-ish regiments that make up the Army of the Potomac. And, at full strength, each regiment is about 1,000 soldiers. Now, unfortunately, again, as we've talked about on some of our videos, those regiments in the early days get decimated by disease. They quickly fall under that 1,000 person strength. So we're not talking about 200,000 people the whole time here, but still, the point is a lot of people. And so he needs to kind of appoint some agents that he trusts that are, competent, and they can report back to him and kind of prioritize some of the issues that he's going to have to deal with. So he appoints brigade surgeons. So a brigade is a collection of somewhere between 3 to 6 regiments. So that kind of subdivides it a little bit. And the brigade surgeons are sort of like the supervisors. They become the supervisors for the kind of lower regimental level surgeons. And so they have kind of an appointed list of things to inspect, responsibilities to have, and they're supposed to report back to Tripler on a regular basis about, how are things in the brigade? Do you need more supplies? Is there, someone that's not doing a good job? Are the camps clean? Things of this nature. So let me see here. And even that system, though, had issues because too often medical officers were ignored when it came to making suggestions to altering camp conditions to prevent disease. And so these brigade surgeons would make recommendations to the regimental surgeons, or, they would, converse, but not every regimental colonel or brigade commander was always receptive to these people making, their suggestions. So one of the drums that Tripler beat pretty consistently, and he would typically use the word properly policing camps. Basically, what he means by that is that if there's someone that is kind of out of line in terms of regulations, in terms of cleanliness, or how the camp should be conducted to ensure the health, then he referred to that as bad policing. And so oftentimes the surgeons would attempt to police these camps, and it wasn't uncommon that they would be ignored. Now, thankfully, over the course of the Civil War, that changes, but in the early days, it's not always the easiest thing for these colonels and brigadier generals to listen to the medical professionals. There's some butting of heads in the early going. And this is kind of a more specific example, but it highlights kind of a recurring problem and a similar type problem that manifests itself in a variety of different ways. So whose tents are they? So one of the things that Tripler was passionate about was making sure that each regiment had at least 3 hospital tents, which would hold 30 men comfortably. So the idea being that each regiment should have hospital tents to hold, roughly 100 soldiers, roughly 10% of their strength, should they be sick with minor ailments. Makes sense. But there were, of course, problems with that. He wrote that the demand for tents and the scarcity of canvas made it necessary to reduce the allowance to the minimum number, or to the minimum that could be made to suffice. These tents, however, were frequently taken by arbitrary authority for other purposes, such as to store other tents, guard tents, and the like. So he's working diligently to make sure that each regiment has all of the medical supplies that they need to have. But one of the recurring problems that would exist in the early days of the Civil War is that the medical stores, either tents or sometimes other supplies, medicines, ambulances, would be taken for no particular reason, or they'd be taken away for non-medical reasons by any number of people, officers in the regiment, or things like that. And this, of course, creates problems when those supplies are then needed, but they've been adapted for use elsewhere. Now, getting to the physical state of the soldiers themselves, there were some real problems, and there would continue to be some real problems with medical examinations. Basically, if you're a soldier and you want to be a soldier and you enlist, before you enlist in the Army, you need to be given a medical exam, a physical, basically, to make sure that you're sort of physically fit to do the duty of a Civil War soldier. And we of course still do these today. It's a very important thing. We want to make sure that you're fit, you're not going to be spreading disease, and all manner of other things. But in the very early days of the Civil War, and this continued to be a problem throughout, but it was especially bad at the beginning, a lot of people were getting passed that probably shouldn't have. And Tripler in his report goes on a huge rant about this, which is, I mean, you can just feel the anger in his voice, or well, in his pen in this case, in this quote. And it's an extensive quote, but it's just too juicy not to quote in its entirety. I just love it. So he says, General Orders number 51, August 3rd, 1861, commanded that when volunteers were mustered in, they should be minutely examined by the surgeon and assistant surgeon of the regiment as to their physical qualifications. I question whether this most important order has ever received the adequate attention from the persons whose duty it was to execute it. So notorious was the neglect of its behests, or the incompetency of those who pretended to obey it, that another general order from the same authority was demanded and issued on December 3rd of the same year, which declares that the evidence was abundant that this duty was neglected and threatened to make the derelict officers pecuniarily responsible for disregarding it. The effect of this neglect, incompetency, or dishonesty has been always to swell excessively the ratio of sick to the whole force. So basically, by not properly examining these prospective soldiers, there are way more sick than there should be because they're not fit to be in the Army. Continuing here, the surgeon of the 61st New York reported to me as a reason for his large sick report that he had a large number of broken down men, many 60 to 70 years old, many affected with hernia, old ulcers, epilepsy, and the like. All things that should have been screened out and not allowed to be in the Army as per regulations. Another acting brigade surgeon reported that there had been no medical examination of many of the regiments before they were enrolled. Another, that there were 80 men with hernia and epilepsy in the 5th New York Cavalry. During the months of October, November, and December, 3,939 men were discharged from the Army of the Potomac upon certificates of disability. Of these, 2,881 were for disabilities that existed at the time the men were enlisted. These men cost the government not less than $200 each, making nearly $200,000 a month, out of which the people had been defrauded in a single army through the faithlessness of those to whom the duty of bringing none but able-bodied men into the field had been confided. I mean, a devastating critique, basically saying that these surgeons who were allowing these people with medical disabilities into the Army are essentially defrauding the American public. I mean, it's just a devastating accusation. I mean, it's, like I said, too juicy not to include and read in its full, but it gets even better. He continues, it seemed as if the Army called out to defend the life of the nation had been made use of as a grand eleemosynary, which is a great word, which basically means dependent upon charity, as a grand eleemosynary institution for the reception of the aged and infirm, the blind, the lame, and the deaf, where they might be housed, fed, paid, clothed, and pensioned, and their townships relieved of the burden of their support. Wow. What a rant. And the reason why I include it is A, because of course it's an incredibly rich quote, lots of 19th century passive aggression, great word, eleemosynary, and it illustrates yet another challenge that Tripler has to contend with. So he's trying to sort out the poor doctors that are under his medical department, and he's trying to make sure that the soldiers under his command are as healthy as they can be. They can't be healthy if they have conditions that should have been screened out before they even made it into the Army. So he, over the course of October, November, and December, works at kind of trying to sort out some of those disabilities that might preclude someone from being an effective soldier. Now, talking about disease, I alluded to this a little bit earlier. And some of his quotes about disease, now of course it bears mentioning that in the 19th century, or at least during the Civil War anyway, they don't have widespread knowledge or acceptance of germ theory yet. So of course, disease is going to spread pretty rapidly when no one knows about the importance of washing our hands and cleanliness, general cleanliness, and you know, the danger of people being in quote close confined quarters. Lessons that, of course, we're we're aware of, more aware of now, and we're relearning, you know, every day it seems. So Tripler notes that in 1861, among portions of the Army of the Potomac, measles were a pretty significant issue. And I just think his quote in this regard is pretty interesting and reveals, again, the sort of situation that he has to grapple with. He writes that after more than 30 years experience and observation, I can only say that I have rarely seen a regiment of irregular troops, volunteers. That's what these, the majority of Civil War armies are. They're volunteers. They're not career soldiers. They're the people who were farmers, volunteered to join the army to fight in the war, and then will one day go home. I've rarely seen a regiment of irregular troops in which it did not appear, measles did not appear sooner or later after they had been assembled in camp. Among regular soldiers, the disease is rarely seen. I do not doubt that it is due to the difficulty of securing the same attention to police, to cooking, to clothing, to ventilation of tents among volunteers that is habitual with regular soldiers. So people who are volunteers, which make up the majority of Civil War armies, they don't have the background of, you know, how their camp should be. This is something they eventually learn over time as the war goes on, most of them anyway. But in the early days, disease becomes a huge issue because, as he says, they're not policing, so they're not correcting erroneous behaviors about making sure that the camp is in tip-top shape. You know, they're maybe not eating the most healthy diets. They're not keeping their clothes clean. They're not keeping the tents well ventilated and things like that. These are things that are almost second nature to regular soldiers. So highlighting a consistent and recurring problem. And he goes on to continue to compare volunteers versus regular soldiers. The principal cause of disease, however, in our camps were the same that we have always to deplore and find it so difficult to remedy, simply because citizens suddenly called to the fields cannot comprehend that men in masses require the attention of their officer to enforce certain hygienic conditions, without which health cannot be preserved. To bad cooking, bad police, bad ventilation of tents, and attention to personal cleanliness and unnecessarily irregular habits, we are to attribute the greater proportion of the disease that actually occurred in the Army. My attention was given to these evils from the beginning. So again, when thinking about Tripler, the guy that was before Letterman, I was like, well, this guy clearly was sort of a bumbling idiot. Clearly, he's kind of locked in on some pretty important ideas. You know, the idea of, you know, personal cleanliness, enforcing hygienic conditions, you know, things that are in keeping with what we know to be important when it comes to germ theory. That's not why they're doing it, but they know enough to kind of correlate cleanliness to good health. And so they're like, well, we can prevent disease by keeping things clean. But the issue for Tripler is, like I was mentioning earlier with the irregular medical department, trying to wrangle all these people and make sure everyone's kind of doing what they're supposed to, getting buy-in from the regimental commanders themselves, the Army commanders. He needs to get a lot of people on the same page. And all this stuff can work, but everyone needs to be on the same page that this is an effective way to prevent the spread of disease. And so, you know, Tripler is like, I got the answer. And looking back, many aspects of, you know, his prognosis here are would have proved to be pretty effective. But the trouble is, he needs buy-in not just from the surgeons in his medical department, but the Army commanders as well, and not just at the top, but at the lower level line officers. It's an interesting partnership that I don't think quite gets enough attention. Not only the partnership between a medical director and an Army commander, very important though it is, the relationship between a regimental surgeon and the line officers in the regiment. And this sort of highlights that. Among other things, Tripler is trying out some new medicines here to make sure that his surgeons have access to the best medicine. One of the more effective medicines that's used in the Civil War is quinine, an effective treatment for malaria. Very effective and still used in a number of malaria medications to this day. And the way that he goes about testing it out, and this is the case with a lot of Civil War surgeons, it's some of the earliest consistent applications of the scientific method in American history, and certainly in American medical history. So just to use one specific example, he writes that the use of quinine and whiskey having been suggested as a means of preventing malarial disease, I determined to test its efficacy. There being no warrant for such an issue in the regulations of the Army, I procured a small quantity from a sanitary aid society and received favorable reports of its effects. Upon representing this to the Surgeon General, I was authorized to use it in reasonable quantities to regiments whose conditions seemed most to demand it. I required reports as to the effect, so documenting this. So there's kind of data to support this hypothesis that quinine might be an effective treatment. These reports were generally favorable, so much so that I was induced to keep it constantly on hand afterwards in the purveyor's store. So again, early application of the scientific method to make medical care for Civil War soldiers better. Now, talking about vaccines, I include this mostly because I think it's notable to mention that they did have some early vaccinations in the Civil War, specifically, and I think only, for smallpox. And it's interesting, just reading through some of this, it's hard not to equate some of it today to today, especially, when it comes to travel and, just the way that they're talking about, how they don't want smallpox to spread. It's obviously not a one-to-one parallel with COVID these days, but again, when reading it through the lens of 2020, it's hard not to kind of connect some of the dots. So he writes about smallpox vaccines. Protection of the men against the contagion of the smallpox, of course, received constant attention. While the Army of the Potomac was in process of organization, smallpox was prevailing rather extensively in several of the districts from which the troops were recruited, so like their home states. It was unsafe to travel without protection over any railway in the country. Orders were issued and reiterated for the vaccination of all volunteers unprotected. I also recommended that an order should be published requiring that all recruits for the Army of the Potomac should be vaccinated before they were started from their rendezvous, and that they should be carefully inspected as to this immediately upon their arrival. Not satisfied with what had been done, I asked for and obtained another order in December of 1861, requiring division and brigade commanders to cause the brigade surgeons to again inspect all the men, vaccinating some men unprotected. So he is making sure that as many as possible are vaccinated, and that great care is taken to vaccinate the men before they even leave where they're coming from, to check them as soon as they arrive in efforts to stop the spread of this very contagious disease. Now, hospital space, yet another issue that Tripler has to contend with. And I separate all of these things out, all of these slides out kind of by topic, just to give you a sense of the different things that are on his plate. He's, like any job, he has a number of issues that he has to deal with, and you can't just pick one and deal with it all the way. You kind of have to sort of sprinkle it around to everything at once. And so, as was exposed after the first Battle of Bull Run, there was not nearly enough hospital space in the DC area. And he notes in his report that when he first arrives in August of 1861, between Washington, Georgetown, Alexandria, Baltimore, and Annapolis, there's only 2,700 hospital beds combined. That's not going to get it done, especially when we get to some of these larger battles that Tripler kind of has a sense are coming. The Battle of Antietam, for example, sees 17,000 wounded soldiers in a single day. 2,700 beds, it's not going to cut it. And so on September 1st, Tripler is invited to a sanitary commission meeting, and they kind of conclude after some discussion there needs to be 5,000 hospital beds in Washington alone, and Tripler is arguing for an even higher number, about 20,000. He kind of has a sense for how, just kind of purely based off of his suggestion of numbers, he kind of has a sense of where this might be going. And thanks to action on Tripler's part, there are about 6,000 beds across those three cities by February of 1862. And that number only continues to rise over the course of the Civil War. Now, all of Tripler's efforts since taking over command of the Army of the Potomac are great, but that's just with the Army sitting in one place from August of 1861 when he takes over all the way through early March of 1862. For the most part, the Army is not really going anywhere, but it is an army, and it will one day take the field to meet the enemy in battle. And that starts to happen in March of 1862. General George McClellan, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, comes up with a brilliant plan to take the Army of the Potomac and stick it on the Virginia Peninsula, come at the Confederate capital of Richmond by water, and to shorten the kind of the marching route from basically DC to Richmond, and starting the army in Virginia via boat. Now, what that means for Tripler is we got to move an awful lot of medical supplies, surgeons, make sure the soldiers are healthy, both when they leave and when they get there. It's a host of things that he has to think about when it comes to what I'll term moving day, or at least moving weeks. Takes about 2 or 3 weeks to get the entire army close to 100,000 strong from the DC area. I believe they leave from Alexandria to the Virginia Peninsula, starting at Fort Monroe. So now that Tripler has, as best he can, kind of sorted out a number of the issues, not completely, but a little bit, the issues that we've covered earlier in the presentation. Now he's shifting his attention to getting the medical department ready to move by boats. It's hard enough to move by land. All the sick from the regiments are sent to general hospitals. Convalescents would then be left behind to recover more quickly and to man the defenses of Washington in an emergency. Before the Army of the Potomac leaves, it's organized into Army Corps, and Tripler assigns medical directors to each. His intention being bringing some of the senior medical officers from the general hospitals in Washington for that purpose. His other goal was to move as many supplies, of course, from Washington to Fort Monroe as possible, but he was told by the Surgeon General that he could only take, quote, part, little vague, take part of the medical supplies from Washington, and that he would have to get the rest from New York City, which of course is going to add to that shipping time to get them there. Now, the second half of Tripler's report focuses on the Peninsula Campaign. And in the interest of time, I'm probably going to go a little bit faster than I might care to through this. So Tripler leaves Alexandria on April 1st and arrives at Fort Monroe on April 2nd. So the majority of the army has actually kind of been on the Virginia Peninsula for a few weeks before he even arrives there. He's kind of tying up loose ends back in the DC area. At Fort Monroe, he finds out they have 1,000 beds available. And then he then pays visits to the various corps over the next few days, inspecting their situations, preparations for field hospitals. He fears there won't be enough space to care for wounded in the event of a serious battle, so he makes arrangements over a week or so, April 14 through 20, for hospitals in the north to be ready to receive massive influx of patients, and that there would be at least one hospital ship constantly stationed in the area to receive wounded from the peninsula, take them further north. He makes provisions for that, and that flotilla of hospital ships grows over the time they're on the peninsula. Tripler receives some help from unexpected sources. On April 13th, 6 civilian surgeons from Massachusetts arrived to help. They had been ordered by the Massachusetts governor to go help Massachusetts soldiers specifically, but they offered to help everyone. And shocking though this might be, that was not as common of an occurrence as you might suspect. There are a number of volunteer surgeons, doctors, nurses, whatever, coming from, a particular state. And it was not uncommon, didn't happen all the time, but it was more common than you might think that they would only help people from their specific states. But Tripler goes out of his way to praise those that came from Massachusetts. They were technically ordered by the Massachusetts governor to help Massachusetts soldiers. It makes sense. He's a politician. He wants his constituency to see that, he's helping their family members basically, but they are medical professionals. They want to help as many people as they can, so they offer help to all. And then on April 19th, Surgeon Henry H. Smith arrives, the Surgeon General of Pennsylvania, aboard the steamer William Wilden, which was full of bedding, stores, instruments, corps of 18 surgeons and dressers, and a large number of sisters of charity for nurses. And he also brought some embalming toolkits to embalm the dead and send them back home to their families. And Surgeon Smith, the Surgeon General of Pennsylvania, ends up becoming kind of Tripler's right-hand man over the course of the campaign. They do a lot together. I get the sense from his report that they spend a lot of time together and that they develop a pretty high degree of professional rapport. He goes out of his way to praise Smith repeatedly, and I'm imagining in my mind there's a great sort of buddy cop movie, or at least, or maybe a drama with these two teaming up to care for as many as they can. Now, before any really intense battles take place, more soldiers are going to get sick on the peninsula. And so in an effort to keep as many beds, local beds on the Virginia Peninsula open, he sends as many sick as possible north via steamers and ships. To northern hospitals. Again, he doesn't want to be caught flat-footed in the event of a massive battle. And so he tries to keep those beds as open as possible. This is all a little easier on paper than it turns out to be in real life, of course, like many things. Tripler turned over a vessel, the Ocean Queen, to be fitted as a hospital ship, and he sends it to the Sanitary Commission. And the United States Sanitary Commission proves to be the supplier of a number of hospital ships, and he figures, okay, well, maybe they can do one more. They said it would only take 48 hours, but it took much longer than that, and it could only hold, when they were finished with it, 3/5 of the patients that he was expecting, prompting Tripler's comment, of course, in inaugurating a system of this kind under our circumstances, some delays, some awkwardness, and some confusion were to be expected. If I had had at my disposal a few medical officers of experience, these arrangements could have been made with more rapidity and precision. As it was, with the exception of the Surgeon General of Pennsylvania, I had no one on the water who had the faculty of rapid systemization, but all seemed disposed to do the best they could, and I believe the operations at Yorktown were fully as successful as could have been hoped for. And I want to highlight this because it demonstrates, again, that Tripler has all these grand designs about ways, great ideas on ways he can, help keep the Army as healthy as possible. The trouble is, there hasn't really been an Army in American history on this scale. And so as a result, we're asking a lot of people, medical officers, volunteers, to do things they've never really done before. And anytime anyone does something they've never done before, probably not going to be amazing at it right away. And that proves to be the case in the early going on the peninsula. And I just think it's worth highlighting that. Now, the first major battle that Tripler has to contend with comes at the Battle of Williamsburg, fought on May 5th, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 to 2,000 casualties. Tripler attempts to bring hospital ships to the area, but the water proves to be too shallow. So eventually Tripler and Dr. Smith, they get an ambulance train going, collect 100 wounded from the Queens Creek area, bring them back to the hospital ship by 3 a.m. on May 7th. So again, this is taking a long time to get them to medical care. And then Tripler leaves Dr. Smith in charge of that area, and then he heads more directly to the Williamsburg, to the city of Williamsburg, which once the Confederate forces eventually retreat, head closer to Richmond, it turns into, like many towns across the country during the Civil War, it turns into sort of one vast hospital. And he was joined by a number of the volunteer surgeons that I mentioned earlier, as well as some of the surgeons under his command. They oversaw hospitals there at Williamsburg, caring for 700 Union, 333 Confederate wounded. And by May 11th, all the wounded had left Williamsburg to be treated in more permanent locations, and all the prisoners were sent out of the city by the next day. So by 6 days after the end of the battle, all the wounded are taken out of these temporary places that are converted into hospitals. They're now designed to be hospitals and sent elsewhere. When the Union Army left Williamsburg, there were 48 hours of drenching rain, which led to large numbers of sick. It was a little unclear, but basically they were somehow, the soldiers were without as much of their rain gear as they might have otherwise had. And so in addition to all of the wounded from Williamsburg, the hospitals are again overwhelmed by now increasing numbers of sick Union soldiers. So when it rains, it pours, literally in this case. Now, one of Tripler's policies, as I mentioned earlier, was to keep sending sick soldiers north to leave space open in the event of a serious battle. That started to backfire because he starts to notice that tons and tons of sick soldiers are leaving, and he starts to put together that those with less serious ailments and malingerers start to take advantage of this policy. And so around May 20th, Tripler says, okay, that's it. Unless you're very seriously sick, you're staying here. And in sort of a fit of rage, he personally inspects. There's a group of 125 sick soldiers that come, and he inspects them himself. And well, you know, we weren't there, we don't know, but whether in a fit of curmudgeonly rage or maybe this was actually the case, he sends a number of them right back to the regiment and says, basically, you're not sick, get out of here. And he reports the problem to McClellan, says, basically, I'm going to change this policy, feeling convinced that we should soon have no army unless this practice was stopped. Next comes the Battle of Seven Pines, relatively close to the city of Richmond, also known as Fair Oaks. This is the battle where Confederate General Joseph Johnston is wounded and Robert E. Lee then takes over, and you know the rest of that story. On May 27th, there was a preliminary action, not Seven Pines, which leads to a couple hundred wounded, which kind of puts the medical department behind the 8 ball leading up to Seven Pines, which sees, I can't remember off the top of my head, I should have written this down, but several thousand wounded to be cared for. And so as soon as the battle was over, it happens on May 31st and June 1st, when the battle's over, they work at evacuating the soldiers from the battlefield, primarily by boats. And it continues until June 7th, so 6 days to get all of these soldiers out. Tripler still struggled about where to put the sick, because now that they're keeping the sick here, now we have this massive battle with thousands and thousands of wounded. And so he's kind of grappling about exactly what to do with this. And so he orders that existing hospitals be made even bigger, which of course calls for more supplies. And the fact that they're fairly remote from their source of supplies makes things even more challenging. And just to close the loop on the Seven Pines situation, by mid-June, about 2 weeks after the battle had ended, Tripler reported that many Confederate soldiers from Seven Pines remained unburied. Quote, in the course of time, the remains were so offensive as to seriously discommode our camps. Disinfectants were sent to be strewn over the grounds, and every exertion was made to abate this evil. Still, it had not entirely ceased when we left the vicinity. So if that doesn't paint a picture for you, I don't know what does. I want to highlight his use of the word disinfectants. Way back near the start of the pandemic, I did a great interview with Melanie Keekley about her book, Smell Detectives, where she, in the course of the interview, we talk about kind of what they think about disinfectants. Long story short, it's all about making it smell better, not disinfectants as we would think of them today. From here comes the 7 days battles, and as Tripler wrote, events hurried on with great rapidity here. And I won't get into, well, the central drama for as far as Tripler is concerned is the wounded, of course, continue to pile up while the army continues to retreat. And so it's hard enough to care for these soldiers, but to keep moving the soldiers as the army is falling back to its new base at Harrison's Landing. So the 7 days battles start on June 26th, the Battle of Mechanicsville, and the wounded throughout the first few battles are sent back to Savage Station. Wounded are sent there, and there's a very famous photograph, which I definitely should have included here, of the wounded being treated at Savage Station. If you go to the page on our website, or if you just Google Savage Station wounded or Civil War or something, there's an incredible picture of surgeons caring for the wounded, and you really get a sense of the motion in what was involved there. And it was probably taken because eventually they need to sort of abandon that depot, that kind of medical place. And I imagine that picture was taken just hours before it was abandoned by the Union Army. So the group of Union wounded slowly grows at Savage Station, and eventually he gets the order that Tripler is ordered to leave all that could not walk, with a supply of surgeons, nurses, subsistence, and hospital stores to fall into the hands of the enemy. And in what I'm sure must have been an incredibly eerie moment, shortly before he gets that order, he kind of knows it's coming, I would imagine. They're trying to load up the wounded onto these train cars. A large train was loaded at 10 a.m. on June 28th when we found that the railway was in possession of the enemy, and I was reluctantly compelled to take the men back to the hospital. And I can't imagine just the devastating revelation when you see that, oh, there actually is no escape for these wounded soldiers. They will have to stay here. And just the emotions, not just for Tripler, but for the wounded. And this, to me, seems to be sort of the central drama of Tripler's time as medical director. Eventually, Dr. Swinburne, I should say, volunteers to stay behind and lead the party. And as Tripler tells it, I then called for volunteers to remain with the wounded, and to the credit of the medical gentlemen, be it said, all that I wanted immediately expressed their readiness to undertake the duty, knowing that they will almost certainly be captured. Now, exactly what happens to those men, that probably bears further research on my part. Like I said, this isn't quite a finished product yet, this presentation, but Tripler does leave Dr. Swinburne with a note, which basically says, hey, we had to leave these guys, please treat them nice. And more specifically, he uses the line, their humane occupation commends itself under the law of nations to the kind consideration of the opposing forces. Basically saying, I hope you, Confederate person, to whom it may concern, will treat these wounded Union soldiers well. And he makes this kind of oblique reference to the law of nations, which isn't referring to any specific code. There's no international law of war at this point when it comes to the American military. And that's something that gets kind of developed over the course of the Civil War. And there's a great book kind of along these lines called The Hard Hand of War by Mark Grimsley, which gets into that a little bit. But I have to imagine, it was interesting. I mean, ideally, medical personnel won't be captured and sent to prison camps, but we know it did happen. So it's hard to say exactly what happened to those wounded who remained behind. All of this brings us to Tripler's end. Ultimately, after a whirlwind of a week, the Army ends up at Harrison's Landing the day after the Battle of Malvern Hill on July 2nd. There was a huge rain, many of the wounded having no shelter. And they're out there because the Army's been retreating. Tripler started sending the wounded out via hospital ship, but he had to stop for a time so that more supplies could arrive at the port. That's the trouble with using ships in mass casualty situations. Sometimes you need to leave room for supplies to be unloaded. And he writes of the situation after the 7 days: tea, coffee, soup, and stimulants were being constantly prepared and issued. My train of reserve stores had happily succeeded in reaching the position, no small miracle, I'm sure, and the supplies held out until we were able to get more from the purveyor's store ship in the river. And Tripler ends his report pretty abruptly, just like his term of service ended. He writes that on July 3rd, literally 2 days after the battle was over, he wrote that on July 3rd, my successor, Dr. Letterman, having reported, I turned over the department to him. The reports of killed and wounded in this series of conflicts, I presume, were made to Dr. Letterman. I left the Army before there was time to prepare them. So he, I'm sure, was ready for a break. I'm sure everybody was ready for a break after the 7 days. He leaves quickly, abruptly. Letterman just sort of appears. I'm sure there's more of a backstory there, but just in the context of his report, as you're reading it, it's like, whoa, okay, suddenly we're done. To kind of conclude, Tripler refers to his time. In conclusion, he says, my own department was neither a complete success nor a very decided failure. So in Tripler's own estimation, he says, I did a pretty okay to good job, and I didn't do a terrible job, which, for the situation that he came into, I think is an incredible victory for him. And so, like I said, my assumption coming into reading this report was that this Tripler guy, who I had heard of, was kind of a bumbling person who Letterman had to clean up after his mess. But the thing was that Tripler, maybe he wasn't the brilliant revolutionary that Letterman would prove to be, but he was a very capable, medical director who did the best he could with what he had. Now, Letterman goes on to institute things like the ambulance corps, the Letterman plan, a systematized way of evacuating the wounded. We cover that in other videos. But Letterman goes on to expand on the foundation that Tripler builds for him. So that's about the end of my formal presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. So I'm going to go through and tackle any questions in the comments. Just want to mention again, if you enjoyed this and other presentations, we would encourage you to become a member of the museum. It's just a one-time annual payment for as low as $25 a month, and those $25 memberships add up over time, and they support programs like this. So it would mean the world to me if you could become a member and support research and help us keep our doors open, all that sort of stuff. And now that we are open to the public, now Wednesdays through Sundays here in Frederick, and the Claire Barton Missing Soldiers Office, which is also one of our museums, it's in DC, that's open by appointment on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So you can now, if you become a member, not only know that you're supporting the museum, you can actually take advantage of your benefits, get free admission to the places, and come say hello to me or any of our other friendly staff members in person, if you can, or if you want to. And you get 10% off in the gift shop. What's not to like there? Anyway, on to the comments here. Let me see, a lot of people saying hello, good afternoon. Janet Oakley says that her great-grandfather was an assistant surgeon with the 11th Pennsylvania. Very cool. Let's see here. Andrea, good question here. I know the numbers were nowhere near Civil War numbers, but what was done in the Mexican War as far as organization and treatment during and post-battle? Well, the biggest change that I would, or the biggest difference that I would highlight is, like you say, the numbers. So Civil War armies, we're talking somewhere between 50 to 120,000, varied pretty widely, obviously. Um, in the Mexican War, armies are 10 to 25,000 strong. And that difference in scale makes all the difference. So in terms of the medicines and the treatment and what the organization looked like, it was not nearly as systemized as the Civil War medical departments become, like with the Letterman plan and such. But I can't get too much more specific than that. I'm not as much of an expert there. But it's a really good question, and I think probably would make a good comparative study. We got someone tuning in from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Very cool. Rogerio, hopefully I said that right. Let me see here. Yes, Andrea asked another good question. Why on earth wouldn't regimental officers be willing to have surgeons attached? Great question. Again, probably has something to do with you know, the fact that they're volunteers. They don't know how important it will become. There's that butting of heads there. Let's see. Well, Robert Smith chiming in here, regimental officers often had preferences for their own, quote, hometown doctors who sometimes failed to meet standards. Also the resources, horses, tents, wagons, logistics got in the way of their war planning, thought it was going to be quick and underestimated the number of injuries. Great point. It was not uncommon for military officers, both high-ranking and low-ranking, to kind of see the medical department more as a nuisance. So great point. Let's see here. Robert says, the chaos of First Manassas makes me think, what was West Point for? Of course, the answer is training engineers. Yeah, not a lot of practical exams in terms of, you know, field command, the chaos of a battle. Did the U.S. have a chief medical officer pre-Tripler? Good question. Yes, there was a Surgeon General that was in place, and there was, Tripler was the first medical director of the Army of the Potomac. So other Union armies had their own medical officers, but not every army has the illustrious career of the Army of the Potomac, and not every medical director is succeeded by Letterman, a medical genius. Let me see here. I can see how you might want a new job after the 7 days. Yeah, no complaints there for changing jobs after that ordeal. Were there objections by the soldiers to being vaccinated, i.e. the original anti-vaxxers? That I don't know. That's kind of a good question. I mean, like anything in medicine, any sort of medical discovery, I'm certain there were people that pushed back on that. I think almost no medical innovation, maybe ever, was ever instituted and everyone was suddenly like, oh yes, we have this now. How were we so dumb before that we didn't figure this out or have this? There's resistance almost at all times to kind of new medical theories, ideas, which sometimes a little skepticism is healthy. Sometimes new ideas don't end up proving to be useful or good, and you know, sometimes that skepticism ends up impeding progress. Sometimes it's tough to know where that line is. But to directly answer your question, Andrea, not sure, but I'm certain there was some resistance. Let me see here. None of the medical supplies were sterile, as Marcus mentions. Yes. Dean mentions, if I remember, they had a new base of supply at White House Landing on the York River. That's correct. There were a few different points along the peninsula that Tripler mentions. I didn't mention them specifically because I didn't have a map, and I didn't want to kind of get everyone, including me, my head spinning about all the various supply bases. Let's see. Eddie says, very interesting and informative on a physician that I felt was not the person of the times. Thanks. So glad to help clarify that. Dean says, thanks, John. It's been a great afternoon. Always a pleasure to spend time with you digitally, Dean. Appreciate you saying something. Let's see, Matthew says, John, how did Tripler handle the large quantity of surgeons who had no medical background? Many of the regimental surgeons had experience as butchers, for example, because they knew how to cut bone, muscle, etc. Some were trained when they got into the Army to learn how to determine types of wounds, locations of bullets, debris, etc., reasonable treatments for such. Great question. Early on in his time as medical director, he convenes a examination board. Technically, these surgeons had been examined before coming into the Army, but he creates basically another kind of and I should note, examined by the states. He creates kind of an internal examining board to kind of root out those that maybe shouldn't have a job as surgeons. So it was, and it was complaint driven. He wasn't necessarily going out and kind of grilling each surgeon, like, are you actually good at your job? It was more like, people submitting complaints, and I'm not sure who those people were, whether they were soldiers or officers or what that was like, but they would submit complaints and say, hey, can you take a look at this guy? And then they would hold a review, and if you didn't pass muster, you'd be sent out of there. Let's see. Robert Smith says, it seems Tripler's most difficult challenge was to get a bunch of independent frontier fighter surgeons working together on a bigger team with different kinds of wounds, not arrowheads, but mini balls and cannon fire with different kinds of wounds. Great point. The surgeons that did have experience in the Army or treating wounds were primarily treating arrowhead wounds. Mini balls and things were just sort of a different challenge. So you're absolutely correct. Getting a cohesive team to work together. And that's why I say Tripler kind of lays the foundation for Letterman to kind of succeed. John Willen correctly points out that Tripler designed an ambulance of his own. So he's a man of many talents. I didn't bring it up in here, but yes, you're quite right to point that out, John. Always good to have John hanging around in the comments here. Robert Smith says, excellent presentation, John. It seems like a possibility for a short biographical pamphlet would be helpful. Expand from a blog article. Yeah, I'm sure this will eventually, all my notes and things here will kind of expand and morph into something, a few blog posts, an extensive article, who knows. And again, I did just basically consult one source here, which, for a historian is kind of a no-no, but it's just such a deep and rich source. There's so much to consult. So if I wanted to be more comprehensive, I need to kind of look at some other things. Yeah, it'll become something someday. So stay tuned. It was fun to share it with you all today. And as John Willen correctly points out, the Winchester Accord in June of 1862 protected medical personnel from, they'd be treated as non-combatants, certainly for that specific occasion, and it did set a precedent that was often upheld, but not always. That was, it's a little unclear to me, and maybe I just need to do a little more research on it, but it's a little bit unclear to me, like how local or specific that was to that one situation in Winchester. It shouldn't be downplayed how notable and significant it was. It did set a precedent, and it was alluded to at times, after that happened. But I question a little bit how far-reaching the Winchester Accord was and how useful that might have been for those at Savage Station, for example, that I mentioned in the presentation. But something I need to look a little bit more into. And with that, I've reached the end of the comments. Thank you so much for being with me today on this Wednesday afternoon. It was a ton of fun reading your comments and going through this with you all. Hope you learned something. I know I enjoyed reading what you had to say in the comments there. If you enjoyed this, consider liking the video, share the video. All that helps us a ton. And if you haven't already, consider becoming a member. That goes to directly supporting video content like this. I will be back with you all on Friday of this week at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. I'm going to be interviewing David Silkenat about his book, Raising the White Flag, How Surrender Defined the American Civil War. And it's coming to you at an earlier time because he lives over in England. So we want to accommodate with his schedule. So should be a lot of fun. Tune in or early or circle back around and watch it later in the day. And hopefully I'll see all of you later this week.